In our study of Sri Aurobindo's description of renunciation in the Integral Yoga, we have seen how the external renunciation is not the intention here, and it is an inward renunciation, and especially and above all a renunciation of attachment and craving of desire. In the senses and the heart, self-will in the thought and action, and egoism in the center of the consciousness. And we come now to this, the center of all resistance in the egoism. In the paragraph we read last time, we saw how the ego works in subtle ways, and its most effective disguises are altruism and indifference, by which the ego can easily conceal itself and even divert the attention of the divine spies, as he puts it, who are missioned to hunt it out. In the solution to this problem of egoism, Sri Aurobindo offers us the formula of the supreme knowledge. And that is, we have nothing to do in our essential standpoint with these distinctions, for there is no I nor thou, but only one divine to express that, to serve that, to fulfill that is all that matters. So we saw how complete and profound this sentence is. We not only recognize the divine self in us, in others, but equally in each one, and then equally in the individual and the group, and there may be many groups and hierarchies of groups, and to realize the awareness of the self, to express, to serve and fulfill that, that should be the single focus of our effort. And then all these possibilities of the ego disguises, the complex forms in which these distortions can pop up, are all dealt with by this single formula. And if, he says, our service to the self requires us to do something which to others may seem as if self-service or egoistic self-assertion or egoistic enjoyment, even then we should do. Because it is not what others think which matters. And the influence of others' expectations, he warns, is a subtle influence of the environment which has a tendency to create a veil over the inner eye, because we are preoccupied with seeing things from others' viewpoint. We do not see what is true from within. And so he says, all this is vanity, the renunciation, the spotless sainthood, the appearance of indifference, all this is vanity. We may be called upon to assume these things, for that may be the uniform of our service, but equally it may not. The eye of man outside matters nothing. The eye within is all. And so here the priority is set. The external view does not matter, only the inner perception is required. And in its eyes, if we have to put on a dress, a garb, an appearance, which may seem to be selfish or personal benefit, even that is to be accepted because it does not matter what others think. Now, this puts a very difficult responsibility. How are we to know that we are not deceiving ourselves? How are we to find that right guidance, know that right intimation of what is intended? In Sri Aurobindo's Thoughts and Aphorisms, forward and breaking free from some fixed or wrong conception. And he deals with this problem of the true nature of renunciation as well as the true sense of the inner guidance and how do we find that guidance. I have some passages which I had marked for sharing in this context, but there are many which build further before and after. And so I will just read from a few. In the first series, this is on page 16 and 17 in the category called Jnana. Some of the aphorisms go like this. All renunciation is for a greater joy, yet ungrasped. That means in the very act of renouncing something, the goal is to reach something still greater. It is not renunciation for the sake of renunciation. Some renounce for the joy of duty done, some for the joy of peace, some for the joy of God, and some for the joy of self-torture. But renounce rather as a passage to the freedom and untroubled rapture beyond. So we may renounce for a cause, but all these are good. But he says renunciation itself is to be as a passage. And then something extraordinary, and he places always opposites together and forces us to rise above. Only by perfect renunciation of desire or by perfect satisfaction of desire can the utter embrace of God be experienced. For in both ways, the essential precondition is effected, desire perishes. So it's a very interesting view. Renouncing desire will lead you to the utter embrace of God. But also, perfect satisfaction of desire can lead you to that. Because in both cases, you have the first requirement to experience embrace of God, that is, desire has to perish. So when you renounce utterly, desire goes away. But also, if you have perfect satisfaction of desire, then also desire is extinguished. And then he says, Vivekananda, exalting sannyasa, has said that in all Indian history there is only one Janaka. Not so. For Janaka is not the name of a single individual, but a dynasty of self-ruling kings and the triumph cry of an ideal. Now, this is the first of a series of aphorisms, and he introduces Janaka here as an ideal. Janaka is the father of Sita. He is the great king who is also a rishi at the same time. He rules his kingdom with all the efficacy required of an effective ruler, administrator, king, loved by the people, loving the people, with great humility. And yet, at no point is he attached to anything in his kingdom or in his position or in his relationships with any. There is an incident where he, with his authority, orders a certain action, and Sita, at that time still a child, asks him, how is this right? And she observes that you said that no one can out it and says, yes, you're right. And he goes on and gives a different command. But that's the kind of humility which you see even in his rulership. And so Narada is given by Vishnu the example of Janaka as a great sannyasi. And he says, how is that possible? This man is living in all the opulence and all the riches. How can he be a sannyasi? And there's the whole story of how he is tested. And a great rishi comes to him. Janaka asks for the revelation of the knowledge of Brahman. And during the period when this knowledge is being revealed, someone but in front of the knowledge of Brahman, he does not interrupt that which is the liberating knowledge for the world. In the story, of course, all personal attachment. So Sri Aurobindo points out that it is not just a single individual that is Janaka, but a dynasty of self-ruling kings. A self-ruling king is somebody who is not just master of his external kingdom, he is master of his internal kingdom. It is an idea in the Bhagavad Gita that Samarat, meaning king of all things, is possible only when you are first Swarat, ruler of yourself. Unless you have mastered yourself, you cannot master your circumstances. And it is to this which Sri Aurobindo is referring when he says dynasty of self-ruling kings. Now, self-ruling kings means you do not have to have a kingdom outside to rule, that you are master of your own inner kingdom. And then whether you have an external kingdom or not is irrelevant. And so Janaka is an ideal of a dynasty of self-ruling kings and the triumph cry of an ideal. Then Sri Aurobindo compares the ideal of Janaka with the ideal of the sannyasins, those who have renounced the world, renounced responsibility, renounced wealth, power, and put on the ochre robes. He says, in all the lakhs of ochre-clad sannyasins, how many are perfect? It is the few attainments and the many approximations that justify an ideal. So this aphorism places the ideal of the sannyasis on a great height, on a pedestal. And although there are very few who have attained that perfection, even the attempt to reach an approximation is itself the true sense of the sannyasa and justify the ideal. But then he says, there have been hundreds of perfect sannyasins, because sannyasa had been widely preached and numerously practiced. Let it be the same with the ideal freedom, and we shall have hundreds of Janakas. So why is it we have great sannyasins and hundreds of them? Because it was a widely practiced ideal. But now the time has come to shift the ideal, not in renunciation of world, but in a renunciation of ego and desire. And by this ideal freedom, popularized, widely preached and numerously practiced, you will have hundreds of Janakas. Then he says, Sannyasa has a formal garb and outer tokens. Therefore, men think they can easily recognize it. But the freedom of a Janaka does not proclaim itself, and it wears the garb of the world. To its presence, even Narada was blinded. So the dress, the clothing put on by the freedom of Janaka is the clothing of the world. He has everything which the world offers. And the next, hard is it to be in the world, free, yet living the life of ordinary men. But because it is hard, therefore it must be attempted and accomplished. That is to be in the world, living the life of ordinary men apparently, and yet free within. When he watched the actions of Janaka, even Narada, the divine sage, thought him a luxurious worldling and libertine. Unless thou can see the soul, how shalt thou say that a man is free or bound? So this was one set. Then another series, which is again he on the theme of renunciation. He says, honor the garb of the ascetic, but look also at the wearer, lest hypocrisy occupy the holy places and inward saintliness become a legend. So just because somebody has taken to sannyas, wears the ochre robe, we should not be deceived by the appearance. Look within, he says, to see. But you see, the point of saying this is the same applies in the reverse situation. Just because somebody has the garb of the world, you should not presume that he is a libertine. You have to look within and see. So it is suggested by pointing to the opposite. And then he says, the many strive after competence or riches. The few embrace poverty as a bride. But for thyself, strive after and embrace God only. Let him choose for thee a king's palace or the bowl of the beggar. So the reference here is not what you seek, but what the divine chooses to give to you. And whatever he gives is what you accept and fulfill. And then, because now the opinion of others and the opinion of the world comes into the picture, what is vice but an enslaving habit, and virtue but a human opinion? See God and do his will. Walk in whatever path he shall trace for thy goings. So vice and virtue are put in context. Vice is something which is compelling. It's a habit which enslaves you. But virtue is also just a human opinion. And so none of these really matter. I skip one and go to the next. How shall I know God's will with me? And this is the question we have. I have to put egoism out of me, hunting it from every lair and burrow, and bathe my purified and naked soul in his infinite workings. Then he himself will reveal it to me. You will see the similarity with the passage which we read last time, where a similar image is there of the egoism which has to be pursued egoism out of me, hunting it out from every lair and burrow. So first part is this becoming conscious of the egoism within us and refusing that, removing that. And then there's the positive aspect. The first is removing, and then what happens? And bathe my purified and naked soul in his infinite workings. There is this opening of oneself to be filled by his infinite consciousness. And then he himself will reveal it to me. And the next, only the soul that is naked and unashamed can be pure and innocent, even as Adam was in the primal garden of humanity. So he gives a deeper symbol to the whole story of Adam and Eve, that this is the soul which is bared before the Lord. There are aphorisms on altruism, and then the role of self-denial as a purification, as a step, and so these are all worth reading. What should I follow? And there is always this conflict of what we are taught, the teachings, the sacred books, and they all have so much wisdom. They are all so important. So there is another aphorism where he says, yes, the scriptures are infallible, but your mind's understanding and your heart's feeling are fallible. So this is not so by stating that it's not in the Shastra, you're reducing God to the book. But the next aphorism, by which standard shall I walk? The word that God speaks to me, saying, this is my will, O my servant? Or the rules that men who are dead have written? Nay, if I have to fear and obey any, I will fear and obey God rather, and not the pages of a book or the frown of a pandit. And the next, thou mayst be deceived, wilt thou say. It may not be God's voice leading thee. So when you say that I will follow my own guidance received, how do you know it's not something else? Yet do I know that he abandons not those who have trusted him even ignorantly. Yet have I found that he leads wisely and lovingly, even when he seems to deceive utterly. Yet would I rather fall into the snare of the living God than be saved by trust in a dead formulary. So the idea here is, although there is the danger of deception by anything, any guidance, any voice, any pretentious feeling or suggestion, but he says, if we have put trust in him, even with ignorance, because we start with our ignorance, if we've put in trust in him, then we know that he will lead wisely and lovingly. In practice, this can take the form that one tries to feel as truly, as sincerely as possible what is the right thing to be done, and then one starts moving in that direction with the faith that if we have misunderstood, if there is a mistake, if there is a mixture, then there will be a further indication which will reveal it and shows the right correction. So he speaks of how the Shastra, following the Shastra is good because it helps us to grow stronger and control ourselves. But beyond the Shastra is the direct guidance of the divine. And finally, we skip to the last couple of them, which are quite fascinating because they indicate the general turn of human development in history. He says, medieval Christianity said to the race, man, thou art in thy earthly life an evil thing and a worm before God. Renounce then egoism, live for a future state, and submit thyself to God and his priest. The results were not over good for humanity. Modern knowledge says to the race, man, thou art an ephemeral animal, and no more to nature than the ant and the earthworm, a transitory speck only in the universe. Live then for the state, and submit thyself ant-like to the trained administrator and the scientific expert. Will this gospel succeed any better than the other? So these are two phases humanity has passed through. In a medieval religious phase, it was submission to the priest, to God, and some future possibility. In the modern world, there is the idea that we are here by chance, we are also products of chance evolution, and so the only thing which matters is to serve the rational administrator and the scientific expert. So the next aphorism leads to the further step. Vedanta says rather, man, thou art of one nature and substance with God, one soul with thy fellow men. Awake and progress then to thy utter divinity. Live for God in thyself and in others. This gospel, which was given only to the few, must now be offered to all mankind for its deliverance. So this is the Vedantic teaching in essence. But it was given only to a few before, because during a certain period of history, not only that the larger humanity would not have been able to accept, understand, or practice, but also because it had to pass through certain experiences, through those difficult passages of the medieval religious phase and then the modern phase, before it is ready for this truth. And so we just reread this. Vedanta says rather, man, thou art of one nature and substance with God. So in nature we are one with God, in substance we are one with God. One soul with thy fellow men. So even in the soul essence we are one with all beings. Awake and progress then to thy utter divinity. This is the direction of our evolution. Live for God in thyself and in others. So when we live for God in ourselves and then in others equally, then automatically these distinctions of greater or lesser, inferior or superior, all begin to fade, and we see one larger, greater goodness, which is what we serve. So we'll set aside the thoughts and aphorisms and now move to the text. In the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo takes two great examples of the true sense, demonstrating the true sense of renunciation and the skill with which ego can deceive. So first, he takes from the Bhagavad Gita the situation in the Mahabharata, where Arjuna is now at the center of this great battle which is to take place. On the opposite side are his cousin brothers and all the great teachers who have taught him, his brothers, as well as those cousins. Each one of them is a giant in history. Each one of them is a man of great knowledge. And then there are the large numbers of soldiers and their leaders, kings, from all across the nation, all across the region of the subcontinent of India and a few even beyond. They have all been brought together. And in this great battle, irrespective of who wins finally, most of them are going to be killed. And at that point, suddenly, the whole burden of this event weighs on him. He feels himself responsible for this outcome, that so many are going to die. And for each one who's going to die, there is a whole family behind who's going to mourn the death. And their wives, children. And so many have been brought together. The destruction that will take place will leave a gash, a wound in the entire civilization, which will take many generations to heal. And all this for what? Because the land that rightfully belonged to them was taken illegally by the cousins. And they would have been satisfied even with 5 villages which those cousins denied. And all the wrong which happened successively through a series of events, the center of which was who is in power, who is in authority, who rules the kingdom. And when you think about it, it seems so silly, so trivial, but he gets overwhelmed by this. And is it worth it to fight, to have so much destroyed for something so silly and trivial? So this situation is first taken up. Sri Aurobindo writes, we see in the teaching of the Gita how subtle a thing is the freedom from egoism which is demanded. Arjuna is driven to fight by the egoism of strength, the egoism of the Kshatriya. He is turned from the battle by the contrary egoism of weakness, the shrinking, the spirit of disgust, the false pity that overcomes the mind, the nervous being, and the senses. Now you see both movements, what brought them to the battle, and which is now the movement which is making him want to run away from the battle. Both, he says, are egoistic movements. The first was more obvious because it's the egoism of strength. But the second is not so obvious. It is also an egoism. The contrary egoism of weakness, shrinking, spirit of disgust, false pity that overcomes the mind, the nervous being, and the senses. And when it overcomes the mind, your mind feels and thinks differently. But when it overcomes your nervous being and the senses, your body refuses to move. And Arjuna, who is this extraordinary, strong character, is not able to pick up his bow. He says, the bow is falling from my hands. I can barely stand. And he sits down. His knees will not support him because that's the nature of the egoism hitting the nervous being with the false pity. But why is it false pity? Isn't it a genuine pity that all this destruction should be avoided? So this is explained. But first Sri Aurobindo points out, both these forms of egoism are not the divine strength, not that divine compassion which strengthens the arm and clarifies the knowledge. So there is a false pity versus a true compassion, and the true compassion fills you with strength and gives you clarity of knowledge. When you have to do something, even when the act may require suffering or violence to others, at that moment, because you know that this is necessary for a greater purpose, it is with great compassion that you act, but also with the clarity of the knowledge. But we'll see the complexity of the situation as we further continue. But this weakness of Arjuna, this weakness comes garbed as renunciation, as virtue. So Arjuna says, better the life of the beggar than to taste these blood-stained enjoyments. I desire not the rule of all the earths, no, nor the kingdom of the gods. So he says, even if I win, I will enjoy the kingdom, but the kingdom I will enjoy will be so stained with blood. Can I even ever enjoy it? So I do not want this. I do not even want the earth. I do not even want the kingdom of the gods. So there is a complete renunciation. And in that renunciation, it comes forward as a great virtue. I do not want all these things. I will become an ascetic. And then Sri Aurobindo comments sarcastically, how foolish of the teacher, Krishna, how foolish of the teacher, we might say, not to confirm this mood, to lose this sublime chance of adding one more great soul to the army of sannyasins, one more shining example before the world of a holy renunciation. This is very rare for Sri Aurobindo to be so sarcastic, but precisely to ram home this point that this kind of a renunciation has not done the world any good. In fact, it has been the cause of enormous suffering, enormous avoidable destruction, because people shrank from forceful, violent, or painful action. And as a result, humanity had to suffer more. He has another aphorism where he says something like this, that when you are asked by God to act in a certain way and you refuse to act, you cause a far greater violence, you inflict a far greater violence on the world. I do not know if I can find it, but that's the idea behind it. That to refuse an action which is required in the larger picture, in the divine perspective of things, to refuse action is a greater violence. So our concept, our idea of violence or wrong action needs to undergo a change here. And so Sri Aurobindo says, from that perspective of the sannyasin who withdraws from the world, it would be a sublime chance. And here is a great man, a great warrior who would be added to the army of sannyasins. So this is a sarcastic statement, but it describes an actual situation which happened in India in the last 1,000 years. As a result of the decline of the civilization, when the spirit of India turned away from fulfillment of the divine in life and sought an otherworldly realization, sannyasa became a renunciation of world. At that point, the decline of India began. And Sri Aurobindo observes that the number of sannyasins were growing. The best minds, the most powerful and great leaders were turning to withdrawal from the world. And at that point, if not for the shock of the invasions, India would likely have become a nation of monks. It is the shock of the invasions which woke up society, compelled a response in material circumstances to fight, to overcome, and it is that which began the reversal and the correction. But even at that time, you will find, in the midst of all the invasions, you have great saints who preach withdrawal from action, inaction, in devotion to the Lord, and so on. But the result of all those has been this weakening of the civilization. But Sri Aurobindo points here now, having said this sarcastically, but the guide sees otherwise. the guide who is not to be deceived by words, because he is seeing through into Arjuna. And he says, quote, "This is weakness and delusion and egoism that speak in thee." So weakness, delusion, egoism. So the first part is when Arjuna is unable to face the burden of this because he is not sufficiently strong. It's his weakness. When he is unable to face the burden, he is overwhelmed, his mind is clouded, he cannot see clearly anymore. Delusion. And then, in the midst of this, rather than rising above his limitations and serving a higher truth, it is the ego that he serves. I want to withdraw, I want to shut down this whole effort. This is weakness and delusion and egoism that speak in thee. Behold the self. Open thy eyes to the knowledge. Purify thy soul of egoism. And afterwards, fight, conquer, enjoy a wealthy kingdom. So this is Sri Krishna's advice. Of course, the condition in which and the means by which one is to be freed of the ego, behold the self, and serve the larger will of the divine is the theme of the rest of the Bhagavad Gita. But this is the action which the teacher, the guide, enjoins on Arjuna. In the present circumstances of life, we could take many examples like this and look at the nuances of complexity involved. One common example that people give is, what if you were before a great tyrant who is about to commit some great crime? If you had a chance, should you not knock him out before he becomes this great leader who takes the whole civilization to perdition? And if at that point you are in tune with the divine will, perhaps that may be the divine command or perhaps not. Because in the larger vision of things, if you see the way things were moving, there was already a great alignment of forces leading inevitably to the war. This individual was only incidental to that alignment. If you removed him prematurely, the alignment would pick on another individual and the same circumstance would happen. So removal of the individual would not be a solution, at least at that point. It would be the force which would have to be opposed. And at that point, perhaps an expression of knowledge, a bringing forward of a greater wisdom which could prevent the war would be the right action. Once this individual is selected by the balance of forces, once the individual comes into prominence and becomes representative of the mindset, at that point, the removal of the individual might help to break that mindset, or might not. And even there, whether to kill him or not would depend on whether it would help truly in the larger outcome. So in all of this, I'm taking this example only to show that in all of this, you cannot take a common rule from a book or apply a simple superficial logic and say, this is right and that is not right. One has to be able to see more deeply to know truly. Or one is sufficiently pure that even without a full perception of circumstances, one knows what is the right action to be done and one does it as a transparent instrument. Sometimes in the midst of the action, one realizes the true purpose of the action, and sometimes even long after, one is able to see it. But if the mind also was purified, then even as one would be an instrument for action, one would see what is the divine intention, the divine will, and the reasons for it, and one might even have the capacity to articulate why and how this action was justified or not. So this we take as the first example, and the second example Sri Aurobindo takes immediately after from the Ramayana. And in the story of Ramayana, Rama is from some internal palace intrigue, he is banished to the forest along with his brother and his wife. And in the forest, Ravana steals his wife, takes her to Lanka, and Rama has no army of his own. He is required to abandon his kingdom. So he must actually move around and raise an army in order to be able to fight Ravana. And then there is this huge battle that ensues. Finally, Ravana is killed, large parts of Lanka destroyed, burned, and all those things happen just to bring his wife back. Is it worth it? And so this is the question he takes up. Or to take another example from ancient Indian tradition, it was egoism, it would seem, that drove Rama, the avatar, to raise an army and destroy a nation in order to recover his wife from the king of Lanka. But would it have been a lesser egoism to drape himself in indifference and misusing the formal term of the knowledge to say, I have no wife, no enemy, no desire. These are illusions of the senses. Let me cultivate the Brahman knowledge and let Ravana do what he will with the daughter of Janaka. Would that have been a lesser egoism? Is the question Sri Aurobindo places. These are in fact arguments which we find put forward even today when people will say things like, oh, they have their authority, let them do what they are assigned to do, you do what you are assigned to do. Why do you interfere with somebody else? And these are convenient excuses to withdraw from a responsibility, especially a responsibility where one sees that a great crime is being committed. There are democratically elected leaders. Hitler is an example. He was democratically elected, used the machinery and mechanism of the election to impose something which was contrary to humanity and human evolution. Even if it seemed at that point that his election was justified and his policy was justified by the will of the people, which it was not perhaps, but still even if it seemed, it would still be wrong because the action itself went against human evolution. And so one has to see things from a larger perspective. Ravana may have been the rightful king, but his actions and perhaps even the support from his own nation for those actions were against human evolution. And there are examples in the Ramayana of the Asuric character. Although he was a great ruler, although he was just to his own people, although his people were all happy, wealthy, comfortable, still the nature of the rule perpetuated was one which was pointing towards evil and harm for humanity. So the circumstance of the wife being freed and the army and the battle are incidental to a larger action which was necessary, of which this becomes symbol. The adharma, the anti-dharma action of Ravana is symbolized in the act of stealing Rama's wife. So Sri Aurobindo carefully uses this word, misusing the formal terms of the knowledge. You see the statement, I have no wife, no enemy, no desire, these are illusions of the senses, I must cultivate Brahman knowledge, is something which would be true. It would be true to all of us in all circumstances. But in this case, to use that as an excuse for indifference and inaction would be a misuse of the formal terms of the knowledge. And then the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo brings the focus back to the inner. The criterion is within, as the Gita insists. It is to have the soul free from craving and attachment, but free from the attachment to inaction, as well as from the egoistic impulse to action. Free from attachment to the forms of virtue, as well as from the attractions to sin. Now, this is the double side of the detachment. It is easy to speak of freeing oneself from attachment to sin. But to free oneself from attachment to virtue is not so easy. Equally, it is easy to speak of freeing oneself from egoistic impulse to action and so lapse into inaction. But to be free from inaction is much more difficult. There's an interesting incident when Mahatma Gandhi's son came to meet Sri Aurobindo. He saw Sri Aurobindo smoking and he said to Sri Aurobindo, "Why are you attached to smoking?" And Sri Aurobindo responded, "Why are you attached to non-smoking?" And the man had no reply. But the idea here was, it is not that you give up smoking, it is the point that you give up attachment. Smoking was only incidental. But one can easily cover up and deceive oneself. I have a friend who's been smoking for many decades, and he said, "Oh, it's not a problem. I have given up smoking many times." But precisely because he is required to go back again and again, each time he is facing stress, he gets sucked into it. Obviously, it is not a true freedom. And I have narrated here the example of Swami Vivekananda, who truly loved and enjoyed the vegetable called potol in Bengal. And then one day, because everywhere he went, disciples would prepare potol dishes for him. So one day a disciple foolishly asked him, "Swamiji, why are you so attached to eating potol?" And Swami Vivekananda said, "No, I'm not attached to it. And just to prove it to you, I will stop eating potol from now on." And for the rest of his life, he didn't eat it. And that was it. He just set it aside. There was no sense of the pull, the lack, the sense of loss, or the anguish that one feels when something is torn away from the heart's attachment. He set it aside. But while it was there, he enjoyed it thoroughly. While it was not there, he enjoyed whatever. But the terms of this free from craving and attachment is free from attachment to inaction as well as to egoistic impulse to action. Now in practice, how do you do this? Because when you start trying to get detached from both, what do you do? Because anything you do could be an expression of an attachment. In the way one sees human nature, there are broadly two approaches. There's one type that is temperamentally drawn more to action. So this type would rather act even if in mixed action than not act. There's another type which is more naturally observant, thinking, pensive, introspective. And this type would rather not act than act with mixture. So it's just a difference of starting point. One has to take a station according to one's nature of more of this or more of that, but then from there grow to develop the sense of right and a right action. Sometimes the right action is obvious, especially when it concerns the well-being of a large number of people. At that point, one is willing even to sacrifice one's own comfort, one's own life even, as happens at the time of battle. A soldier on the battlefront knows, being right there in front, you are cannon fodder, meaning you will not come back. Everyone knows it, even the family knows it, and yet everybody not only accepts it, but heroically. Because at the back of the mind, you see that this sacrifice is for the protection of the larger community, society, some ideals. And so one accepts such a loss. But in other areas, with regard to food, with regard to pulls and pushes between friends, relatives, my friend would like me to come and visit him over there. My family members would like me to come and visit them over there. And meanwhile, I had made a commitment to somebody that next time that I'm in this town, I will visit you. And I'm pulled in three different directions. Each pull is equally important to my heart. And it's much more difficult at that point to be able to rise above and see what is right action, true action. Sometimes the right action is not the form of what you do, but the state in which you do. And one has to find the right balance, and it may change from day to day. On one occasion it may be this, on another occasion it may be that. At that moment, something, someone, some requirement is most needed. And if you're sensitive to that, then you recognize this. And then to the others, you can deal with the right state in the right way. So, free from attachment to inaction as well as from the egoistic impulse to action, free from attachment to the forms of virtue as well as from the attraction to sin. Are you prepared to do something which to others will appear unvirtuous just because it's the right thing to be done? Are you prepared to lose your reputation in public and the appreciation of all the people who say, oh, what a saintly figure you are? Except when you did that action, that is unacceptable. You are no more a saintly person. We will not accept you as a good person anymore. Are you prepared to accept that? And that's the most difficult thing to deal with. And you don't even have a chance sometimes to explain why or how. If you have to do it, that's it. You face the consequences one way or other. That's when it is extremely important to find the right guidance and the right sense within. So Sri Aurobindo says, the criterion is, it is to be rid of I-ness and my-ness, so as to live in the one self and act in the one self. And then he continues, but just before we continue, one way by which we can do this as a step in between is to stand back from the whole situation. Observe the situation from a third person. Better still, observe the situation from the perspective of the self above, which is including all these people in the picture and all these circumstances. And when you see from above, it becomes clearer. And a very interesting incident experience I had. There was a person who was a bit of a mystic, I had met, and we had some discussions, and he said, I'm enlightened. So I said to him, what does that mean? And he said, oh, like Ramana Maharshi, I woke up one day and I was enlightened. So I said, does enlightenment include for you self-realization? He said, what's the difference? So we went into a whole discussion, and so there are degrees. Enlightened is an undefined word. You can have degrees of light, grades of illumination. It does not mean it is self or liberation in the self. So whatever. Some kind of a liberation, some kind of light he had experienced. He was a nice person, I liked him. But one day we met, and I felt something unusual. We were having lunch, and I found something in his consciousness so different. And then I asked him, you're so different, what is it? And he said, the last few weeks, I have been trying to see myself and my life from the perspective of the universe. And you see what that does? Immediately his consciousness had shifted outside the personal individual focus. The universe is the greater reality. And how does the universe see this body, this mind, its role, its life in relation to other bodies, other minds, their role and their life and the collective life? And when you see from that high up, perspective of the universe, this body and that body and the other body are equally important, isn't it? At least superficially. This mind, that mind, the other mind have their differences, and perhaps at this moment this or the other is more important, or some action is more important than another. But the whole perspective is completely impersonal. Is in the domain of material form only. If I could break through that idea of universe and go all the way to that which manifests as universe, that would be the perspective offered here. So Sri Aurobindo continues, just to complete that story. So it was a very beautiful thing. I was very happy to see him then. The next time I met, I found something had dimmed of that glow which he had. And subsequently later he had got sucked into some interesting work and he had become a very important person in that work. And one didn't feel that thing anymore which was there. Perhaps it was there, but at least one didn't see it so obviously. So here, it is to be rid of I-ness and my-ness so as to live in the one self and act in the one self. To reject the egoism of refusing to work through the individual center of the universal egoism. When seen this to the exclusion of others, because I cut myself off, I am the center of the universe, the rest are less important, and as I serve myself, there is the egoism. But if all the others are equally me, and I serve myself, it is not so egoistic. Because myself includes them equally and takes all of them into account. You will see this happens in the behavior of a mother to her children, even among animals. A mother would rather deny herself food in order to give to her children. Why? Experiences the children as herself. She experiences in the children her own extreme vulnerability, which is greater than the vulnerability in her as the body that she is. And therefore, the food is given to the most vulnerable parts of herself, which are the children. Something like this is what happens when we experience ourselves one with others in the self. They are all equally me, my other forms. And so when I act, I share in what is natural to the totality of me. So, in principle, serving the individual mind, life and body is not the problem. It is when it is exclusive of others. So that is one form of egoism. But the other egoism, which is more subtle, the egoism refusing to work through the individual center of universal being. So from the perspective of self, there is only one self, one universal being, which has so many individual centers. It so happens this individual center of this body is more in priority in the awareness, or not. But this can refuse to act in the larger universal being. So the refusal of the ego to act through this individual center is also egoism. Because in the larger universal action, perhaps this being has to do something to protect itself, to nurture itself. There's the story of Birbal. Birbal says everybody is only interested in self-interest. And Akbar, the king, says that's not true. You will see in animals, the mother will give up for her children. So Birbal says, let's see, I will prove it to you. So the story goes, they put the monkey and its child in a tank and start filling it with water. So at first, the mother puts the baby on her head until she begins to drown. At which point, suddenly she reverses and puts the baby down and climbs on top. Now it's a story. Maybe it happens or not, I don't know. But at that point, Birbal says, see self-interest. But perhaps there is something deeper there also, that in that act, if the mother had drowned and the child up there would not be supported, it would also drown eventually, both would have drowned. In that act, if the mother had died, the child would not have the necessary means to survive in the jungle. But if she survived, she could have other offsprings, the child, that or other children. And so in the balance of things at that point, the balance suddenly tilts. The survival of this one individual is more important than the collective. And the individual must assert its survival or its requirement over the others, even if it seems egoistic in the eyes of the world. So that's the point here. Refusing to do that is also egoism. So it's a very broad picture, frees us from all fixed ideas of what is good, bad, right and wrong. To live in the self is not to dwell for oneself alone in the infinite, immersed and oblivious of all things in that ocean of impersonal self-delight. So this is now the third kind of egoism. I may be in the oneness of the self, in its infinity, in the delight, and I may choose to merge myself into that in abandonment of the world. Because this is so beautiful and the world is such a painful place. Perhaps by doing this, I even serve the world. But he says, when we speak of living in the self, it's not to be in that exclusion. What is it? But it is to live as the self and in the self, equal in this embodiment and all embodiments and beyond all embodiments. So the true self, in its completeness, is not just in that transcendence, it is equally in the individual, in the collective, and in the transcendent. So when we speak of living in the self, it should be in the totality of all three. Then only we say we are truly living in the self. This is the integral knowledge, Sri Aurobindo concludes. The other, losing oneself in absorption in a transcendence of self, is a partial knowledge of self. And so in the integral yoga, this aspect of the participation and living in the self as self and in self is equally in the individual consciousness, in all the other embodiments, and in the transcendence. So it is here that the yogi experiences in himself not only what he experiences, the joys and sorrows, sufferings or enjoyments, but he experiences equally what others experience as himself. And their joys, their sorrows are equally his. And all of humanity, and perhaps even all of nature, perhaps even all of the universe. He may choose even to modulate how much he identifies with those things or how much he does not, but they are still his. Just as my right arm may be paining because of an injury, but I may choose to withdraw my attention in order to be able to function. But it does not limit the fact that it is my arm which is hurting, that it is in pain. I just withdraw the sensation from there. In the same way, he may withdraw the sense of the suffering of the cosmos, but it does not remove from it the fact that it is his own body, his own consciousness in others in which that suffering takes place. So from such a perspective, when one acts, then you experience this challenge of the monkey and the baby in the water rising. And the yogi may be seated in the forest. A tiger may come and say, I am hungry. Give me your body to eat. What would be the right response? If it was a superficial egolessness, it doesn't matter. I and tiger are one, so eat my body. I will continue to live in you. Simple enough, right? This is the reason why nature implants in us the ego. No, tiger, don't kill me, please. So the ego is what protects us, separates us. But when we transcend the ego and when we experience the larger self, tiger and I and the trees and the birds, not only here but tomorrow and day after, are all part of me. And in that balance, perhaps, it may be, no tiger, you cannot eat me, but I will help you to find food. So the relationship changes according to our level of consciousness. From the egoless state in the beginning to the egoless state later, there's a big difference. The first egolessness was not capable of serving anything worthwhile, was not a fit instrument for manifesting a greater knowledge or action. In between is the passage of the ego formation in which some kind of development is possible of the individual, breaking through to a greater kind of egolessness in the self, in which an enlightened consciousness can act free of ego. So, to live in the self is not to dwell for oneself alone in the infinite, immersed and oblivious of all things, in that ocean of impersonal self-delight, but it is to live as the self and in the self, equal in this embodiment and all embodiments and beyond all embodiments. This is the integral knowledge. And so from this, Sri Aurobindo now takes up the completeness of the discussion. After all this, we may say, well, all those things which are taught in the traditions to reject, to deny, to inhibit, all of those are their waste. And Sri Aurobindo now brings the picture in completion by putting in context those practices, why they are important, how they can serve as a passage in between, but eventually one has to let go of them. So the next paragraph says, it will be seen that the scope we give to the idea of renunciation is different from the meaning currently attached to it. Currently, its meaning is self-denial, inhibition of pleasure, rejection of the objects of pleasure. But then he explains, self-denial is a necessary discipline for the soul of man because his heart is ignorantly attached. Inhibition of pleasure is necessary because his sense is caught and clogged in the mud honey of sensuous satisfactions. Rejection of the objects of pleasure is imposed because the mind fixes on the object and will not leave it to go beyond it and within itself. This is the reason why those three practices are required. But if the mind of man were not thus ignorant, attached, bound, diviner joy. So if we were not thus entangled, then none of these things would have been required. We would have just grown from joy to greater joy. But right now that's not possible because we are entangled. And therefore, as a first step of disentanglement, self-denial, inhibition of pleasure, rejection of the objects of pleasure are a useful and necessary discipline. But after one has become free, after one is now tuned in to the enjoyment of the divine in things, one has to let go of these even and rise to something still greater. And that is the challenge which he points to. So this paragraph is extremely important. We'll continue it next Friday. We can pause here briefly and take up any questions or comments that you have.
Ego has to be rejected. What is the use of a ego? Why it has been there first?
Yes. So if ego has to be rejected, what is its use? Precisely at an initial stage of evolution, there is a need to form a unit of individuality. in which later on the divine can fill and act through. At first, when evolution emerges, it emerges from a substratum of universal substance, matter, living matter, thinking substance. But if just evolution continued like that, you would just have one big mass. You would not have the play of possibilities of individuals playing around. So to have a play of multiplicity, you have to create several separate individuals. For creating the individual, there has to be initially a focus in evolution to assert individuality over universality. That's the ego. And by asserting its separateness first, it develops, grows to become sufficiently complex, at which point now relationships are strained. There are forms of tension, or at best collaborations of group egos. And there is a need at that point to complete the evolution by replacing this temporary device of nature by the true person, the self. And then suddenly, you have one self in many different centers, each uniquely expressing the same oneself, entering in unique relations with the same oneself, now in different forms. And this is a setting for the unfoldment of the divine play. So the first step of that is the formation of separateness, which is the sense of ego. Yes.
I don't know if I understood correctly, but I felt it is to take the responsibility according to higher values, which might free us from this egoistic withdrawal from actions.
Yes.
And this must be the criteria. It is following a higher value if I take on the responsibility of it.
If you use the word higher values, the question could be asked, in whose eyes higher values? And different cultures have different values which are lower or higher. And none of those would be the requirement here. The only value would be what is right in this action of the self, in the view of the self. And that may change moment to moment. It could not be reduced to a value because a value is still predefined parameter, predefined reference. Whereas in the self, there is a constant flux in circumstances and the self may choose differently at each moment. Yes. So it may even be, the right thing would be to rise above values, including all values of ethics and morality. But that rising would require a training passage through ethics and morality to master oneself before one can be free of them. Yes. Now, why this is important today is because in the past in humanity has precisely been taken through this training for centuries, for millennia perhaps. We ourselves in previous incarnations have gone through those kinds of training and are on the brink where a concept of rising above even ethics and morality is now accessible to us. And therefore, this is the time when that possibility is ready to be realized and humanity is poised, not in its whole, but at least in its higher parts. And so this discussion is even meaningful. But as we, representing perhaps the higher aspiration of humanity, as we make the efforts and begin to live by this larger perspective, it will have its ripple effect in the rest of humanity. So we must keep in mind that a lot of work has been done in the past across lives, the results of which is still in us, even if we do not remember so obviously. In closing for today, because some of you have to go for the program, we can keep in mind that the tradition that says what you do on the New Year's Day is often symbolic of what is to follow through the year. So for us to dwell on the concept of a true renunciation and its practice in life is an excellent start for the year. And if we can make this the theme of our practice for the year, it would be a worthwhile year for sure. And there are many ways one could begin this. One would be simply dwelling in thought on the idea of the one self immanent in all things and also transcending above. And then try to see things from that higher, larger viewpoint to whatever extent our mind can recognize. And just that will begin to reduce the extreme importance we give to ourselves. The second could be as a practice that in all our collective life circumstances, we take into account including your own. It does not mean self-denial. It means your needs are as important as all of the others. But what would best serve in the balance at this moment? At least to dwell on that idea, even if you do not follow it. But dwelling on it, very soon you will find yourself tilting in that direction and gradually experimenting and flowing in that direction more and more, with the faith that as you flow along that line, you will be helped, you will be guided, the picture, the circumstances will become clearer. And finally, to virtue and the importance that we give to what people think and our need to appear but even when acting with what we know to be right, to be conscious of others' sentiments and when necessary to use a balm. There's a comment one of the teachers in the ashram made once. If you have to perform surgery on me, then please apply first the anesthetic. In other words, if you have to do an action that is going to cause me some distress, take the necessary steps to take into account the discomfort I will have and reduce it. So even when we have to take an action which may cause discomfort to others, we are conscious of their need to be comforted and provide the necessary support to the extent required or possible even. So these are some interesting starting points we can dwell on, and just the act of thinking, meditating, observing, feeling will begin to ripple a change in our daily life. We'll continue next Friday. And a Happy New Year to all. Om